Okay, so today I am going to talk about all the books that I have read in the first half of February. So as you know, if you've been around for any length of time, I started doing mid-month wrap-ups in December and I think they're going pretty well. So I'm planning on continuing those for the next foreseeable future. I talk about all of my stats and everything at the end of the second video of the month, so the second wrap up, which usually comes out sometime the first week or two of the next month. So let's talk about the books I read in the first part of February. So the first book that I read was actually the punishment book that I got in my February TBR. So I didn't know whether I would need to do this, but I ended up deciding not to try and force myself to read the final book on my January TBR. So I did end up needing to have a punishment, but also I really wanted to read this book because it is an old favourite of mine that I haven't read for quite a while, so I just wanted to, see what I thought of it now. And that is The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. This book is really interesting and I really enjoyed it on my subsequent reread. I think it is my fourth reread. Not 100% sure. Like I said, it's been quite some time. But either way, I did really enjoy this book. If you watched my most recent vlog, you would have seen that a little bit it was making me feel uncomfortable. But I soon kind of got over that, I guess. It was making me uncomfortable because, well, this is the part where I probably need to describe what this book is about. So we follow two main characters, Henry and Claire, and as the name suggests, it is about a time traveller and his wife. So Henry is the time traveller and he has what they end up coming to believe is some kind of genetic disorder, which means that he travels backwards and forwards in time, usually backwards, although he does go forwards occasionally, and he travels along his own timeline. He often ends up going to places or people which are very important to him in his life. But because he's a time traveller, he doesn't necessarily always know in advance that those things are important to him, if that makes sense. So he travels back in time to before the thing may or may not have been important to him. That's a really weird explanation. It is a very strange book. There's a lot going on. So anyway, the point of all of that is to explain that Henry visits his wife's younger self from when she is 5 years old. He starts appearing in the meadow near her home and they develop a relationship. At first it's very much sort of more of a kind of uncle figure type of thing, but as the relationship goes along and he keeps appearing in her meadow and keeps interacting with her, she starts to ask questions about where he came from, who he is, and as she grows up he sort of starts to feel like she has more ability to handle certain things, and so he tells her more about their life together because in the present that he's coming from, they are married. Now, when they meet in real time, he has never met her, so she grows up knowing this man, but when they meet in real time, it's before he started travelling back in time to her, because obviously before she becomes important to him, he doesn't travel back to her. He starts traveling back to her when they are married and she becomes important to him. It's a really interesting premise and I think that it's handled really, really well. I really, really like the way that Audrey Niffenegger writes these two characters. They're both written in a very sympathetic way, particularly Henry, and Henry isn't necessarily the most likable of characters. When Claire meets him in the present, he isn't really that likable of a person. There's a lot of conversation about the nature of what makes us who we are, how much of our personalities and our intentions are locked up in how much of it's linear, how much of what we see and experience changes who we are, how much of who we are changes what we see and how we see things, and I find that really, really interesting. The thing that I found a little bit difficult to get my head around when I was reading that this time, which I never experienced before, Henry is very careful when she's younger to make sure that he doesn't do anything that would be really messing her up. I guess as she gets older and as he starts to view her as older, he kind of lets on some information and lets a little bit lax. And I found that a little bit uncomfortable, but that's also partly I think that's because I'm a bit older than when I first read it, but partly I think it's also because you're seeing that actually quite early on in the book until you really started to understand Henry's personality and the way that Henry views things. And as the book goes on, you start to see that Henry views things as things happen regardless of what he does. So he thinks anyway, that he's drawn to really important things in his life. Like I said, some of those things aren't necessarily good. Sometimes when he goes back, he does things to try and change things, and it never changes things. So he sees things as somewhat inevitable. He doesn't see himself as like a Terminator going back in time to change things in that way. And he's not like that was a bad way, but you get the idea. He's not going back with a specific plan in mind. He's just kind of gets thrown to certain places. He always goes back in time naked, so he often ends up in very weird, very uncomfortable situations. He has to do a lot of petty kind of criminal behaviour, breaking into places, stealing clothes, stealing food, beating people up, all of this sort of thing to survive the situation that he finds himself in when he goes back in time. And so that happens in his life before he meets Claire. So by the time he meets Claire, he's not the nicest people, and it's kind of meeting her that starts him down the path of becoming the really decent person that she grew up with. So it's very interesting in that regard, and in terms of thinking about how linear is time really. I still really enjoyed it. I thought it was incredibly well written. It's a long time since I read this book. I read this book for the first time in 2005, so that was, quite some time ago. But yeah, I definitely still think it holds up. I definitely still think that it's a really well-written book. I really think that the characters are well-written, their motivations are well-written. You really have an understanding of what's going on. I love the way that the time travel is done in this book. It is not done in a way like in your typical sci-fi time travel. It is done as though it were, some kind of genetic disorder. So that's really interesting. And Henry has no control. He never has control over what happens to him, where he goes, why he goes there, or anything like that. So I thought that was really, really interesting. Yeah, so I'm definitely glad I reread it. I'm not 100% sure if I was doing it again, whether I would put it in my, I may end up doing it again, in my top 10 books of all time, or top 10 standalones, as I did. That will be linked below if you want to go check that out, because I've read so many other books since 2005 when I would have put this in as a favourite book, but definitely holds up and I definitely really enjoyed it. This time around I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, so yeah, highly recommend. Alright, so the next up I want to talk about Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. I actually listened to this on audiobook, and again, if you watched my most recent vlog, I did say that I listened to this actually as a BBC radio play rather than a narrated audiobook. I didn't intend to do that. I thought I was downloading an audiobook from the library, from the Libby app, but I wasn't. I was downloading a radio play. But because I've read this book multiple times and I know it very well, I decided that it didn't matter and that it was perfectly acceptable to read the book in that format this time. So I've read this book multiple times, I've seen the TV show, I have now listened to the radio play. Every single time I listen to it, watch it, read it, whatever it might be, I absolutely love it. This is one of my favourite books of all time. It will no doubt remain one of my favourite books of all time. It was no different this time around. I thought the radio production was really well done. I thought the voice actors were fantastic. Yeah, so I really, really enjoyed this one. 5 out of 5 stars, absolutely. So this is a book about the apocalypse, or more specifically about the not having an apocalypse. So it features a cast of crazy characters, 2 of whom are an angel and a demon, and they are present in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve commit their crime and get thrown out of the garden. They're going to have a little conversation at the end of this experience and decide that they're going to team up to sort of keep each other abreast of what's going on and what each side is doing and all of this sort of thing. So then you cut to 2,000 odd years later. The apocalypse was always going to happen. It's a fight between good and evil, and the way that they are going to do it is that there's going to be the Antichrist, and he's going to be brought up on Earth, and then when he's 11 he's going to cause the end of the world. So this plan is put into motion in, well, it's contemporary to when it was written. So it was written in 1990, and that's when Crowley and Aziraphale team up to try and stop the end of the world. Crowley and Aziraphale have been on Earth since the beginning of time, and they have really enjoyed being on Earth. They really like all the little perks of being on Earth and all the little things that humanity have created, and they don't want it to end. So they team up to stop the end of the world, and it's basically about that. It's about the Antichrist, who is a young boy called Adam. It is about the apocalypse and the apocalypse nearly happening, so there's lots of crazy things happen. If you've read either Neil Gaiman or Terry Pratchett, you will recognise both their hands at work in this book. It is very tongue-in-cheek, it is very sarcastic, it is very British humour, it is very silly, it is very over the top, I think extremely amusing, and yeah, I definitely will always be one of my favourite books. I think it's incredibly well written, I think the characters are really well done, and I just think that it's fantastic. It is not meant to be taken seriously, so it's not it is not a like serious post-apocalyptic Hunger Games type book. It is meant to be silly and funny, so if you like that sort of kind of ironic British humour, I definitely think that you would like it. And not that I wouldn't recommend it to everyone, because I would recommend it to everyone. I have recommended it to anyone that I know, but I think that it has a particular type of humour. So I wouldn't necessarily say that if you like fantasy you'll love this book, or if you like comedy you'll like this book. You have to kind of like both. If you like Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you will love this book. If you already love Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, you will love this book. If you like anything with a kind of weird, dark sense of humour, you will like this book. Definitely recommend if those are the things that you would appreciate. But yeah, thoroughly enjoyed listening to the BBC production of Good Omens, and I will put the information about where you can get hands on that particular version in the description below. The next book that I want to talk about is The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is the book that Rowan chose for me, so I got the card, Rowan's pick, and he chose this one. It is one of his all-time favourite books, and it's a book that I have been intending to read for the longest time. I've heard so many great things about this book, not just from Rowan, although absolutely 100% from Rowan, but also from a variety of different booktubers that love this book. This is a fairly common book on booktube, but it's not a super common book on booktube. It is not a Sarah J Maas. It's not everywhere, but everyone that talks about this book loves this book. I don't think that I can think of any booktuber who I have seen discuss this book who doesn't love it. I am no exception. This is an amazing book. This is so well written. It is so fun. It is so well paced. It has you on the edge of your seat. It's just fantastic. So, this book follows Locke and his merry band of thieves. So we have five main characters. We have Locke Lamora, we have Jean, or I kept saying Jean, it's spelled G-E-A-N, but I think it's meant to be Jean. We have Bug, we have the two Sansa brothers, and they make the Gentlemen Bastards. So the whole series is Gentlemen Bastards sequence, and they are a team of thieves and a team of con men, and they are best friends, and they live together, and they just perpetrate all sorts of cons and thefts on the city in which they live, which is the city of Kemmerrer. So this is a fantasy. It is high fantasy in the sense that it is set in an entirely different world. It is high fantasy in the sense that there is magic, although magic does not play a very big role. It plays a very important role, but it doesn't play a very big role in the story. So the main characters aren't magical. Most of the people in the city aren't magical. Magic is very much the, what's the word I'm looking for? Province of some other people. So it's in another world. It's high fantasy in that sense. It's high fantasy in the sense that there's a lot of mythology and traditions taken from our own history but put into a fantasy world. So I think that this is based on the city. I think Kemmerrer is very much inspired by Venice in Italy. Even the picture on the front cover looks very Venetians. With this one here, looks like the Bridge of Sighs in Venice. They talk about the rivers, they talk about the canals, they talk about floating markets. So the river is a very important part of the environment and the city, and then also plays quite an important role in the story and some of the things that happen in the story. Yeah, so it's very loosely inspired, I think, by Venice. There's something very Shakespearean about this story. The way it was written more than the story, I guess, itself. I'm not 100% sure what it was, but it just felt very Shakespearean to me. Recently, Rowan and myself and my friend Michelle, who's appeared on this channel, and a couple other people went and saw A Comedy of Errors, and yeah, there was something about this book. When I started reading it, there were a couple of things in there that made me think of The Comedy of Errors. I've said this in a number of vlogs, but I'm actually just going to stop for a second and just reassure everyone who is watching that I live in a part of the world that has managed to be very fortunate and very free of COVID. So we have not, in Tasmania, we have not had a COVID case for about 6 months, like any cases for about 6 months. So when I say that I went to a play or whatever, I am not doing that because I don't care about COVID. It is because it's pretty much business as usual. Life's been pretty normal, and I realise that I'm very privileged and blessed because of that. So I just wanted to let you guys know I didn't want people to think that I was being, non-health conscious or anything like that. So anyway, yes, so there's something that reminded me of The Comedy of Errors, something about the way that Scott Lynch writes and the way that his character, the dialogue he writes in this book, that's very Shakespearean to my mind. That was really enjoyable. It really made it kind of come alive in my brain. I love fantasy, so definitely really enjoyed that aspect of it. But I just really liked the characters the most, I think. I mean, like I said, the story as it builds and the pace builds really well. He's really great at building that pace up to the end where you just can't put it down. In fact, I have finished this book just like 40 minutes ago, and I was determined to finish it today because it was amazing and I wanted to know what was going on, but also I was determined to finish it today because I wanted to talk about it and let you guys know how amazing it is. So the pace is built really, really well. The action is really fantastic. There's just a constant, and that's the other thing that makes me think of Shakespeare, there's just a constant stream of like mishaps that happen, and every time you think that they have gotten themselves out of trouble or they'd sidestepped trouble in some way, something else happens that puts them in even more trouble. So in that regard, it's quite Shakespearean. But yeah, I've heard called this grim dark, and I can definitely see why. A lot of really dark things happen. But it's very different from other grim dark, I don't even know if the Broken Earth trilogy is technically grimdark, but I would definitely say the Broken Earth trilogy is much darker than this one. Something about the way Scott Lynch writes has a sort of levity to it, which I really, really appreciated. Yeah, so like I said, it's really well written. Everything kind of works together. There's nothing in here that feels unnecessary. There's nothing in here that feels like it wasn't intentional. Even though I don't often like books that end and then end and then end again, and that does happen in this book, and you kind of end up feeling like there's been several different ways it could have ended. But I actually thought that was really well done, and it ramped up the pace and the feeling of what's going to happen every time, and it was just really written really well and done really, really well. If you like fantasy, I would highly recommend this book. If you haven't read that kind of high fantasy where there's lots of random names that you don't understand, and it's definitely not set in our world, and there's lots of magic that you don't understand, and there's lots of explanation of the magic, and you have to kind of follow along with all the different races, elves and that sort of thing. If you haven't read that kind of fantasy before, but you are interested in trying high fantasy, I would recommend this one, because even though, like I said, there's definitely magic, but the magic is done by one character, and it's not important to the running of the city, to the plot, because the one character that does the magic has a big effect on the plot. It is not important enough that you understand what the magic system is or how it works, and in fact it's very deliberately kept as quite a secret, both to the reader but also to the main characters, so they don't really understand how it all works either. I really appreciated that. I thought that was really well done. But also it does mean that it's definitely something that if you're not a huge high fantasy fan, you might get a lot of enjoyment out of. It feels more like historical fiction set in a place you've never heard of rather than high fantasy. I would highly recommend, if you love high fantasy, definitely read this. If you are getting into fantasy, you want to give high fantasy a go, definitely read this. But yeah, highly recommend. Gave it 5 stars. Thoroughly enjoyed this book. And thank you to Rowan for suggesting that I read this book. He's been suggesting I read this book for a number of years now. I finally did, and I'm very glad that I did. I think he's very glad that I did. I have 2 more books that I want to talk to you about, but I will make them quite brief. The first one is A Curse So Dark and Lonely, which I am buddy reading with Connor from Connor's Library Corner. In the description below if you want to go and check him out. If you do go and check him out, you probably will see that he has made a vlog where he read all 3 of the books in that series. Curse So Dark and Lonely is the first one. We're supposed to be budding and reading it together, but Connor got quite ill, and that was what he did when he was ill. He read those books. So I have not caught him up yet. I'm about halfway through. I apologise, Connor. I am always slower than you anyway, but in this particular instance, I think it's probably not a buddy read anymore. But we'll still chat about it, I'm sure. I'm really enjoying it. I think that it's really well written, but I'll talk more about that at the end of the month because I will have finished it by then. The other book that I want to talk about is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. So, as you guys know, I started reading this in December and put it down because I thought I was getting in a bit of a slump, thought it was a bit much for me. Then I started reading it in January as my second chance, which was one of the prompts that I got in January. And then I was chatting with Alison, who is a friend of mine who I buddy read with, and she was keen to give it a go. So we decided to make it a buddy read, which meant that I then decided that it didn't count as punishment and extended into February. I have since decided that I'm going to DNF this book. It is not hard DNF. I may very well come back to it, but I just really wasn't following what I was reading. I found that every time I went to pick it up, I was kind of drawn away and drawn to something else. I was really only reading it because it was buddy read and also because 2 good friends of mine love it and wanted me to read it. I really wasn't following it, and so because of that I wasn't enjoying the experience. It's, I think, a bit of a polarizing book. I think if you love it, you absolutely adore it, just favourite book of all time. But I think if you don't like it, you really don't like it. I can definitely see why people really enjoy it. I can definitely see why my friend Alana, who says it's one of her favourite books of all time, I can definitely understand why it's one of her favourite books of all time. Yeah, it was just that little bit too confusing for me. Could partly be that it was not actually a book that I should have been buddy reading. It might have been something I would have been better off sitting down and reading over a few days without any other books, rather than reading 100 pages in a week. So you sit down, you read, then you don't read it again for a while, you read other books. Might have been that, I don't know. So I'm happy to give it another try at another stage, but just not right now. Yeah, so unfortunately that one has been DNF'd for the moment. I've had a fantastic reading month so far in February, and yeah, I'm excited for the rest of February. So I am going to go now. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I really hope that you enjoyed all the things I had to say about the books. If you have read any of the books that I talked about in this video, please comment below and let me know what you thought of them. Let me know in the comments below as well what you have been reading during February and how you've been enjoying your reading month so far. If you've been watching and you want me to know that you were here, then I'd love for you to leave me an emoji. I'm not going to pick one for you this time. I'm just going to let you decide whatever you would like to leave me. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Like I said, I really do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.